A new batch of early state polls from CBS News Battleground Tracker is giving us new insight into the 2020 race. 31% of likely voters in 3 early primary and caucus states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, prefer former Vice President Joe Biden. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are about 15 percentage points behind, and Senator Kamala Harris is in fourth with 10%. Following this group is South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who received 8% of support, former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke with 5%, and Senators Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar with 2%. The other 16 candidates in the field, listed here alphabetically from Bennett to Yang, are all polling at 1% or lower. Joining me now on set with the very latest from the 2020 race are Wall Street Journal reporter Ken Thomas and CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. Also with us from our Washington bureau is CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I think we have blown up our computers officially with the number of candidates in this Democratic field. Too many people. All right. So, Ed, let's start with you. We still have Joe Biden, as we saw in the graphic, in the lead, but it's early. I'm wondering what you're taking away from this poll.
The survey essentially proves that what we've long thought, that he clearly enjoys an advantage given his name ID. But when you try to pin down Democrats on who might actually be their first choice, his advantage shrinks to some extent and yet remains quite wide. That is the nature of a crowded race. That right there, the first choice for nominee, 31 to 17%, that's a big lead. But when you ask, who are you thinking about, who are you considering, an open-ended question that allows someone to give you as many names as they want, he gets 55% of the responses. And so that shows you that, he's certainly in the mix for people, but they're being a little discerning, as one voter put it to me earlier today at an event here in Washington. And it shows you also that people like Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Pete Buttigieg, the South Bend, Indiana mayor, clearly are in the mix, clearly are on the minds of Democrats, and are someone that they're keeping an eye on, voters are, as the campaign progresses. But this is also, quite frankly, proof that it is still quite early and unsettled.
So, Caitlin, let me turn to you. When you look at those numbers, Biden at 31, Warren at 17, Sanders at 16, do you wonder if there's enough sort of room for both Sanders and Warren to kind of run to the left of Biden here as this race progresses?
Well, it was a really interesting question that we were asking when Bernie Sanders got into this race, was whether he could keep his coalition intact, whether he was still kind of carrying the mantle for a lot of his ideas as they became more mainstream in the party. And in this poll and others, we're seeing Warren start to eat in to Bernie Sanders' support. And she's really been doing so because she has first an extensive ground game in places like Iowa, huge infrastructure, really building out a grassroots campaign, but also she's been setting the pace for policy in this race that makes her new to a lot of people, even though she has a national profile here. We saw in the 2016 campaign, when all of those Republicans were jockeying for space in that primary, that a lot of them tried to knock each other out of certain lanes to be able to take on Donald Trump. So you're seeing these kind of primaries within the primary. And this time, with so many candidates, you're going to see a lot of that jockeying going through. Bernie and Elizabeth Warren kind of occupying a similar space of the electorate, but Warren having the advantage, too, of being a woman, potentially the ability to make history there as well.
So there's another figure that I want to pull up from the Battleground Tracker. 67% of early state Democrats believe a Democrat will win in 2020 if they motivate Democrats who normally stay home on Election Day, compared to just 1/3 who believe the path to victory lies in trying to swing over Trump voters. So, Ken, does this create a risk for more moderate Democrats to run, who are trying to run to the center?
That's one of the biggest hurdles that Joe Biden has to overcome in this primary. People like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren will say that you need somebody who can really rile up the base, make people run through a brick wall to vote for the candidate. And the buzz you hear a lot about Biden is that he's an acceptable choice. He's someone who people think could defeat President Trump, but he's not somebody who, brings out passion and in the same way that his former boss, President Obama, did.
So far, we have heard, Caitlin, Joe Biden focus on President Trump in the general election. Of course, he wants to end up as the nominee, but is he risking anything by looking past their primary competition and sort of trying to kind of project this air of inevitability?
Oh, it can certainly be a liability. Look at someone like Jeb Bush in 2016, who amassed tons of money, tons of staff, a real name campaign.
We all know what happened
there. There certainly is that risk for Biden. What separates him from some of these other candidates is that he doesn't have to introduce himself. People know who he is. They're familiar with him. But I completely agree with what Ken said, and we've been seeing that on the ground, that voters do sense a sense of comfort with him. But that support is very soft. And the more these other candidates are able to show to these voters that they could be not only an alternative choice to Biden, but acceptable to them in terms of taking on Donald Trump, the more they could gravitate to those candidates.
So there's a clip that I'd like to play from Joe Biden today where he was asked about campaigning in the South. Let's listen to that.
Well, I plan on campaigning in the South. I plan, and if I'm your nominee, winning Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, believe it or not. And I believe we can win Texas and Florida. If you look at the polling data now, doesn't mean it's a marathon. It's a long way off.
So, Ed, neither Texas nor South Carolina have voted for a Democrat in a presidential election since Jimmy Carter in 1976. So how realistic is this claim from Biden?
It's only realistic if he gets to run like a Jimmy Carter Democrat. And in this day and age, he's not going to be able to do that. So it was an interesting moment that we heard from him there. North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, sure, maybe. But the other two would be a big stretch and would suggest that the president's popularity is just completely tanked and Republicans are sitting on their hands and staying home. But the question came in context of this event designed to focus on poverty and the economy, conversation about the fact that a lot of those communities are actually in the South. They're not just minority communities, but white communities as well. And they're sort of asking the question of the Democratic candidates who showed up today, are you going to focus on this part of the country where poverty crosses racial, gender, and ethnic lines? And that was essentially Biden's response. The other point he made was, look, I campaigned in dozens of congressional districts last year, especially for swing state moderate Democrats trying to unseat Republicans, and it worked. And so Democrats, if you're looking to expand the map and win swing voters, then you better consider my campaign. And, we'll see if that argument holds. But again, he can't win in places like South Carolina and Texas if his party pulls him too far to the left.
So speaking of South Carolina, Caitlin, as you know, we are heading, Red and Blue is heading to South Carolina to be there for Jim Clyburn's world-famous fish fry. He's the House Majority Whip and a Democratic kingmaker, essentially, in that state. Remind us the importance of that event, why it is that it is so critical that those Democratic candidates be seen and heard there.
Mm-hmm. The world-famous fish fry.
That's right, as he puts it.
As he puts it.
And
world, might be getting, global attention just because there are going to be 22 Democrats all descending on South Carolina for this event. It started in the early 1990s as a way for Clyburn to thank supporters of his who helped his campaign, who helped out in South Carolina, who couldn't afford to go to the bigger state party kind of dinner the next night. So it was his way to kind of have a more casual event. And over the years, it's really turned into this place to be among politicians, particularly in presidential years and the years leading up to that as well. So you're going to see all of these candidates flock to South Carolina, and this is their chance to kind of a nod to Clyburn, who will be a key endorsement. He has told us that he is waiting to endorse. He wants to make sure he puts that priority and focus on South Carolina, making it an important state. And this time around, it is really critical. 60% of voters in the 2016 Democratic primary were African American. So you're seeing that as obviously a key constituency and something that candidates want to pay attention to.
Ken, I'm curious, what do you need to be watching for out of that fish fry?
I think it's how can you appeal to African American voters. So much of the race so far has been in Iowa and New Hampshire, and there really isn't much diversity in those states compared to South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And the key thing about South Carolina is that it's often a bridge to the Super Tuesday states, which are more diverse, frequently happen in the South. So this is really the first test case for whether you can assemble a diverse coalition in the way that President Obama was successful in doing.
I also want to ask about a New York Times article which details which Democratic candidates are preferred by Wall Street donors. Ken, this is going to be for you. So Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are the favorites, apparently, according to this Times piece. Donors are also, quote unquote, swooning over Pete Buttigieg. So how much does it open these candidates up to attacks from the left, who are clearly not fans of big donors and Wall Street donors?
It's a much more difficult proposition in this campaign than in past campaigns to go to Wall Street and to seek checks. We had the Occupy Wall Street movement in the past. We've just much more of a liberal party right now that are hesitant to support candidates who may be too close to Wall Street. Biden and Harris are viewed as a safe bet for those investors. Pete Buttigieg, there's a ton of interest right now. He's had to go off the trail and go back to South Bend because there was a shooting in his community, but he can certainly raise here. One donor I spoke to today, though, made the point that, $2,800 checks that are being collected at these events are great, but in reality, this is about online fundraising, and there's so much more money to be made, from the masses than you can earn in a visit to a salon within Wall Street.
It'll be interesting as the campaigns continue, though, what that perception of the willingness to accept those kind of big dollar donations, how that might affect some of these strategies moving forward. All right, Ken Thomas and Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you. My thanks also to Ed O'Keefe.